Every time we get new information about Gary Trent Jr.'s contract situation, it just looks even worse for the player. So much so that in this latest report, the Raptors had an offer on the table that Trent initially refused, but when he came back to actually sign it, the Raptors had pulled the offer off the table. Let's break down this whole situation in today's video. Let's get into it. The saga continues. We are well into free agency here, and Gary Trent Jr. still does not have a contract with the Raptors and still doesn't have a contract anywhere else in the NBA. And it doesn't really feel like that contract is going to be coming anytime soon for the player, as teams have really started to finalize what their roster is going to look like. The second apron has made it even more difficult for teams to take on this additional salary, especially this additional salary that Gary Trent Jr. is looking for. Not only would it be difficult for teams to sign Gary Trent on the value for the player, it's even more difficult when it's very clear that Gary Trent Jr. and his agency, Klutch Sports, are overvaluing what he actually brings to the court. Therefore, here we are. It's July 10th, the time of recording. Gary Trent does not have any offers on the table. So we're going to discuss what the options are for the Raptors as far as potentially keeping the player, potentially signing and trading the player. And we're also going to be discussing what options actually remain out there for Trent to get the money that, well, not the money he's looking for, but to get any sort of contract to be playing in the NBA next season. We're doing that all here on Amateur Sports, the YouTube channel completely dedicated to Raptors content and videos and in live streams. Drop a like if you enjoy, subscribe for more all throughout the offseason and beyond. So this latest report has come out on this situation, and we kind of knew where both parties were at here. If you asked Trent at the start of last season and at the start of the offseason this year, he was looking for a contract in the range of $25 million per year, a big raise on what he was making last year, which was $18.6 million. Now, you and I both know that $25 million contract was never going to happen this summer. Gary Trent made $18.6 million last season because in the previous offseason, he was looking for that big payday, $25 to $26 million per season, but he had never really showcased himself to be a player that was necessarily worth that. And if anything, last season, he had a regression year. But what's very telling about the contract that he had for last season is that it was a one-year player option that he took. He signed a 3-year contract with the Raptors when he did extend initially. Last year was the third of those 3 years, but again, that was a player option that he took. So he was making around $17.5 million. He was looking for that big payday. It wasn't forthcoming, so he took this player option, this 1-year contract, as a sort of bet on himself maneuver. He was betting on himself to perform so well in the last year of his contract that he would exceed all of the offers that he was getting last summer. But he bet on himself and he lost. Last season had the adverse effect. When we had continued to discuss Gary Trent's so-called development in his time with Toronto, he never really had gotten any better. He kind of had just stayed the same player that the Raptors traded for when they traded Norman Powell at the 2021 NBA trade deadline. And if anything, in his most recent season with the Raptors, he not only did he not develop, but he may have regressed. Yet still, at the end of that season, Rich Paul, Klutch Sports, his agency were still looking for that $25 million a year contract, which was just not going to happen. We saw the market kind of get set with a player like Malik Monk signing that 4-year, right around $78 million contract. It's very clear that Gary Trent is not as valuable as Malik Monk, but I still thought that Gary Trent could be looking in the range of $18 to $20 million per season. Perhaps the Raptors would just be satisfied giving him something in the low 20s just to keep him, but as it was, we saw with Gary Trent the play from last season where, yeah, if he's wide open on threes, he's going to hit it. But if he's not wide open on threes, what else does he really bring to the floor? Not much. He can't score on the inside. He's not an efficient mid-range scorer. He's terrible at shooting threes when there's a defender in his area. Not a very good passer. Doesn't create advantages with passing. On defense, he's a net negative over there. There's just not really a ton that he brings to the table other than wide open shooting. Teams were privy to this. The Raptors became privy to this, and all of a sudden his market fell. The Raptors then, this is the latest report, offered Gary Trent a contract worth $15 million per year. Initially, Klutch Sports, his agency, denied this contract. They did not take this contract. They decided to go seek bigger money elsewhere. That's when the Raptors decided to make the trade to bring in even more salary to their already constricted cap space with the Sacramento Kings when they got rid of Jalen McDaniels and took on the salary dump basically from the Sacramento Kings, which was an incredible trade for the Raptors, by the way, in getting David Mitchell, Sasha Vezenkov, and then having to pay the salary for the 45th overall pick, which eventually became Jamal Shead. So the Raptors at that point basically took themselves out of any run even for getting Gary Trent Jr., and therefore they took that $15 million per year contract offer off the table for Trent. So that when he went to go explore his options and what were out there in free agency, and he realized there was nothing, if he did, and perhaps he did, want to come back and sign that $15 million per year contract with the Raptors, it was no longer on the table, and thus we are here July 10th. Gary Trent Jr. still does not have a contract to play anywhere in the NBA, and it's very, very clear he is not going to be getting anywhere close to the $25 billion per year contract that he is looking for. So currently what the options are for the Raptors right now. They have $2.2 million in cap space before they get to the luxury tax. Disclaimer, the Raptors are not going to be that good next season. You have to be a contender in order to justify paying the luxury tax. The Raptors are not going to be a tax team, so forget about that. They have $2.2 million in cap space available to spend. That's obviously not going to get a player of Gary Trent Jr. I've been critical of his play, but that's still way too cheap for a player like Gary Trent Jr. So what the Raptors would have to do in order to keep Gary Trent, they're going to have to shed salary somewhere. The most likely outcome for that is trading Bruce Brown, who's on a $23 million contract, but if the Raptors were going to trade Bruce Brown this offseason, it kind of feels like they would have already done it if they could have done it. So keeping Gary Trent is pretty close to being completely off the table at this point for the Raptors. There is an opportunity for the Raptors to maybe sign and trade the player, but again, we're talking about such limited cap space available. Like, the only reason a team would do that is to have the exceptions for Gary Trent Jr.'s contract towards the cap, which does make a little bit of sense, but still, the Raptors would likely have to get some salary back in that trade, which they just don't really have any space to put on their roster. So, certainly a possibility, but seems rather unlikely. So, what are the options right now for Gary Trent? Listen, if Gary Trent was the player that he thought he was, like if he could bring other stuff to the floor, like if he could be at least a neutral defender rather than a negative defender, if he had any ability to score other than if he's just wide open for three on a consistent basis, then teams would have signed him. Teams would have made space for him. Every team needs shooting. He obviously brings that, but because he doesn't bring much else, there just wasn't really a ton of interest out there, especially as the second apron constricts what teams can do with their salary, with their cap, and what they can do when they want to sign free agents. So the reality right now for Gary Trent, I mean, it's looking a little bit bleak right now. What he's going to have to do, I kind of compare him to Malik Monk once again here. Malik Monk got his payday this summer, but previously Malik Monk has signed super cheap contracts. Like I remember one specifically with the Los Angeles Lakers. We had last season where Gary Trent bet on himself with that player option and lost. He gambled and lost. Well, he's probably going to have to make another bet on himself move. That's what Malik Monk did with the Lakers, took a cheap deal, and it took a couple of years after that, but eventually he got his payday. He proved his worth. I'm starting to think that the likeliest outcome for Gary Trent in the offseason is taking a vet minimum somewhere around the NBA on a good team for 1 year, and that's his prove-it contract. He's going to have to spend that 1 year on salary that is, even by the standards I've set for him, are too low for what he brings. And in hopes, next summer, when teams open up a bit more cap space, he then gets his payday. Is that payday going to be $25 million per year? I seriously doubt it. I mean, something would drastically have to change. But, hey, can we start to get back into the $15 to $18 million per year conversations with the player over 4 years? Yeah, we're probably going to be starting to talk in those numbers next season. So the options out there, like Milwaukee has been floated around, but even a vet minimum is pretty crippling to them from a cap standpoint. So I'm just not sure that's going to be the case. And if it is, I think the idea of Gary Trent is certainly better than what he actually brings to the floor when he's on a better team in big-time games, in big-time settings, especially if you get to the end of the season, he's on a good team. In playoff settings, I think a lot of the weaknesses of his game are going to start to get exposed as well. So unfortunately for Trent, the reality is there's just not a lot of options out there. So he might just have to take on a really bad contract this season. And honestly, you look at his agency here, they made a mistake. They thought that $15 million wasn't enough. They were evidently wrong. And his wallet's going to suffer as a result. Maybe he proves it and gets a bigger contract next summer, but I just can't really see him getting that much money elsewhere. As for the Raptors in this situation, I think they've handled it very well. They kind of understand the deficiencies with his game. It'd be great to have a player like him back, but we're not going to break the bank in order to make it happen. The Raptors are just in the start of a rebuild/retool here, and two of the guys that are going to want to get play time are guys who fit this shooting guard sort of role that Gary Trent brings, be it Grady Dick, be it Jacoby Walter. And as a result of Gary Trent Jr. not being on this team, those two guys are going to get likely a lot more play time than they would have done, a lot more experience than they would have done. And I don't think that's a bad thing for the team. I think, honestly, that's a good thing for the team. If you would have asked me last season when Gary Trent was starting, I would have said start Grady Dick over him. I think Grady Dick brings more to the table. And even if he doesn't, we're tanking, and I'd rather see a lot more of him than Trent. We spent all this time, 3.5 seasons, trying to develop Gary Trent. And if anything, he's only just gotten worse in those 3.5 years. Let's start to invest in people we believe in on a bigger basis to actually improve and be a part of this team long term. I think Grady Dick fits that mold, and hopefully Jacoby Walter will start to prove it in his rookie season that he also fits that mold. I think the Raptors, look, kind of handled this poorly in retrospect, where you're probably not going to get anything out of Trent, but at least if you keep Bruce Brown on his contract, which they did, there's still a possibility of trading him down the line for something of decent value. Whereas for Trent, if you were to sign him on a contract, I really just don't think there's many teams lining up to make a trade for Trent. So in terms of maximizing the assets based on what we saw going into this season, the Raptors probably made the best of this situation, but it's still a shame how it's all going to peter out with the Raptors likely getting nothing out of it. Hopefully we can recoup and we can do well with the replacements this season, and I honestly have the belief that the Raptors will. So what do you make of Gary Trent? What do you actually think he is worth on a year-to-year basis for his next contract? Give me your thoughts and opinions in the comments down below. That's all for me for today. Drop a like if you enjoyed. Subscribe to Amateur Sports for more Raptors content, and I'll see you again next time for another video. Wait, before I go, this is likely the last ever video you will see in this background. I'm moving this week, so if you did like this background, this is the last time you're going to see it. End of an era here, but life goes on.